morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here today. Very nice to see you all and hope you are enjoying your morning so far. We're very excited to have such a great panel here today who will be talking about Sustainable Development Goal 14, the rising tide of data science to build sustainable oceans. And our moderator today is Dr. Melissa Green, COO and Chief Scientist from Pelagic Data Science Systems. I will pass the microphone on to her.
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm Melissa Garren from Pelagic Data Systems. And today, our goal for this panel is to talk about where data science is making progress and helping us move forward on SDG 14. So thinking largely about the oceans. But we also hope to stimulate some discussion here and some cross SDG thinking of where the ocean is also supporting some of the other SDGs that are at play. So we have a wonderful panel up here for you today. We have Dr. Caitlin Augustin from DataKind. We have Sydney Sanders from CEA Consulting. We have Annie Brett from the World Economic Forum and Stanford University. And then we have Dr. Tali Vardi from the Office of Science and Technology for NOAA. So we have a variety of different perspectives for you up here today: industry, government, nonprofit, academia. And we're just going to give we have just a couple of slides apiece to give you an introduction to ourselves so you have a sense of where our perspectives are coming from and who you have here in front of you. And then we're gonna open it up and hope to have a rich discussion here together. So I will give you just a brief introduction to myself. So I'm the COO and Chief Scientist at Pelagic Data Systems. We do data collection on the water. We developed these solar-powered, completely autonomous boat trackers, basically, because out in the world, 95% of fishing vessels are completely unmonitored. So when we're thinking about sustainable fishing and sustainable livelihoods for coastal economies, not knowing where 95% of the boats are going and how much they're catching is definitely a data gap. And traditional monitoring for boats is one location per hour. So you can start to get a sense of where people go, but not what they're doing. And our devices collect 600 data points per hour. So we get really rich data sets that allow you to get from location to actually behavior. So there's an incredible amount of opportunity for data analytics, machine learning, AI, behind understanding what people are doing on the water. So that will give you a flavor of what we're up to. And I will pass this on to Dr. Caitlin Augustin from DataKind.
Thanks so much, Melissa. So DataKind has a simple charge. Our statement is, we do data science in the service of humanity. And the way that we do this is we bring together teams of pro bono data scientists to work with social sector organizations to develop data scienceable problems that help those organizations better achieve their theories of change. Now, how does that actually relate to the SDGs? Well, all of DataKind's projects are actually organized around the SDGs. And if you come to our panel later today, you'll hear about SDG 3 and work we're doing with community health workers. But work related to the environment has been actually part of our DNA since our very first data dive in 2012 when we worked with the New York City Parks Department. And we've done a lot of work related to SDG 14, life below water. Where we actually started with this was our team at DataKind San Francisco worked with Conservation International in their TEAM program, and Conservation International said, we have 3 million images of these protected areas. We have over 6 million climate record points. There's 17 geographies. Can you help us understand what the population density in these areas are so that our wildlife and fisheries managers can actually better inform policy decisions there? And our team said, sure. So it sparked this TEAM project, TEAM being an acronym for the ecology group that was doing this project. Over the weekend, this team of DataKind volunteers built a deep interactive heat map and a data pipeline to allow for continuous updating so that wildlife and fisheries managers could better make decisions. That's just one project that we've done. Completely flipping areas, our DataKind Singapore chapter, sponsored by the 11th Hour Foundation, worked with Melissa and the Pelagic team to actually build a classifier to understand what these fishermen and these fishing vessels were doing. As Melissa said, Pelagic has this new system that allows for far more frequent records of where vessels are moving and what they are doing. But that data is meaningless without an actual way to understand and organize it. So our DataKind Singapore chapter has worked for the better part of 9 months with Pelagic to build a classifier that will allow Pelagic to be able to say, and their partners to say, this is what fishermen are doing. This is the depletion that is occurring in these fisheries. Now we can make better decisions. We can inform agreements in this space so that we can better reach SDGs 14 targets around fisheries and fishery management. While that might sound simple, classification, great. Can't we just ask people what they're doing? Oh, what are you catching? Where are you going? The truth is, it's a lot more complex. As Melissa was saying, they're capturing over, what, 600 points? It's these astonishing data streams. They need to be cleaned. So if you think about how your GPS might work when you're driving your car or you're running, it looks like you're going on the right way, and then all of a sudden, you're by Central Park, it'll tell you you're down in Brooklyn. Like, you have these GPS skitters. So you have to clean the data to understand, okay, where is your boat actually? You have to pull in additional data. So pulling in data sets like climate data, like OpenStreetMap data to actually, like satellite imagery to actually understand and position where those vessels are, not just from the latitude, longitude records. And you need to actually have the context, so to be able to link it back to the people who are operating those vessels. So that's one other project we did. The last project that I'll just mention is that DataKind, we work extensively with image detection projects. So we recently scoped a project in the Mekong River area using satellite imagery, because the group that we're working with at Conservation International wants to know, are people fishing at night, which is against regulation? And using image detection, we're able to actually detect if there are lights in the open water space. And we know that those lights would be coming from boats. There's not a built environment on the water. And being able to have that detection and have that understanding about this illegal fishing occurring will help the research team and their local partners build better policies to protect that fishery. So those are just a number of examples of how DataKind is working on SDG 14. I hope that gives a flavor of how we partner with groups. Our intent is to really first find a problem and make it data scienceable. So we don't come and say, we are data scientists, therefore your problem must have a data science solution. We try to help find the problem first and just know that data science is part of the solution that can be provided to a social sector organization. And with that, I'll hand it back to Melissa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And one of the connections that I wanted to make in that, as we were both talking about sustainable fisheries, is that also very much underlies the effort for ending hunger and also poverty. So we're looking at integrated supply chains in coastal communities that are typically underserved, also looking for opportunities for gender equality where micro-entrepreneurship opportunities exist in those supply chains for women and underserved youth. And so all of these oceany things connect out to a bunch of the other conversations that are happening around the SDGs. So with that, I will pass next to Sydney Sanders from CEA Consulting, and I will give you the clicker.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Hi, everyone.
And I should have clicked it for you.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Sydney, and I'm an associate at CEA Consulting. I help to advise philanthropic organizations on how to create strategies specific to ocean conservation and climate change mitigation. My clients really suffer from two main challenges. They feel like they have a complete overabundance of data that hasn't been synthesized, where there's been no sense making, which might sound familiar. And at the same time, they feel like they don't always know what data exists because they feel that it exists in silos. So as a grant making and strategy advisor, my role is to absorb as much of this information as possible, synthesize it, and provide recommendations for my clients. My organization takes data sets alongside qualitative information that we might have learned through expert interviews or site visits, and we put it into an accessible format to help improve this decision making. One example of this is a platform we've created called Our Shared Seas. We've distilled literature and trends on major ocean problems, and we've put it into this pretty easily digestible web-based platform with connections to the actual data. So marine conservation funders and others can put it into the context of the decisions that they are making. We have collected data such as production data, funding data, trade data from a wide range of sources, including information that we have collected and analyzed ourselves. So I work specifically in the sustainable seafood movement, and what that means, oversimplified, is it's a partnership between industry and nonprofits to cultivate a demand for sustainable seafood, and subsequently, in response to that demand, provide sustainable seafood. So we use seafood metrics to inform millions of dollars of philanthropic grant making each year, and I'll quickly provide a few examples of how we do that with you all today. So stock assessments. This refers to the sustainability or exploitation status of fisheries around the world. Generally, we know from scientific research that fish stocks in North America and Europe are improving, so philanthropy has focused its efforts on the global south. We also aggregate and track information related to the international global seafood trade data. And so what this really means is if we can understand how seafood is traveling from an exporting country to an importing country, then we can understand leverage points in the supply chain to focus our efforts, whether those are companies or countries. We also track and synthesize information related to the public commitments that companies have made to sourcing sustainable seafood. And over the past 15 years, there's been an exponential number of companies in North America, Europe, and now Japan that are committing to sustainable seafood. So now there's been a focus on effort on helping companies figure out how to reach those commitments. The last example I'll mention today is related to the amount of seafood that is certified as sustainable. We know that about 25% of the world's seafood is either certified as sustainable or rated as sustainable by a third party. And so now we focus our efforts on the fisheries in the pipeline that are working on improvement efforts. The last thing I'll mention today is that the sustainable seafood movement interacts heavily with and relies on data from other interconnected oceans issues as we consider, for example, how climate change is shifting the distribution of marine species, which has implications for livelihoods as well as fisheries management. So what this all means is that we have so much information at our fingertips, but not all of it feels like it's quality data. So we have to spend our time synthesizing the quantitative information with the qualitative information in order to provide recommendations. And I challenge the field to continue to create tools that really are facing the decision makers so they can have the synthesized data in their hands to inform their decisions. So thanks so much.
Super. Thank you, Sydney. And next we have Dr. Annie Brett. Clicker.
I do not. Thank you. So I'm just going to back up for a second, and I think it's important to recognize the scope of this problem that we're talking about. And for those of you who are not as familiar with the oceans, the illegal fishing that Caitlin and Sydney have kind of touched on is a huge global problem, $23 billion a year in economic losses, and huge links to poverty and human slavery and other types of really severe human rights violations. So this is a cross-cutting problem that is really important to solve for a lot of different reasons. And so in my work at Stanford and the World Economic Forum, we work all across the spectrum from basic research to actual on-the-ground policy implementation. And while Caitlin has an amazing group of volunteers that are working to move from data to action, and Sydney thinks about the philanthropic community, a lot of my work is on the legal side and how you move from data to actually data that's usable in legal decisions. And that's a really tricky calculus, and there's a lot of problems with some of our data sources currently. Data that's collected by non-scientists, data that's collected by certain types of sensors is simply not usable in enforcement and monitoring for international and national laws. And so I think it's really important that we begin to think about how you create data collection systems that have an end use in mind and that are recognizing that you need to fulfill legal requirements and other kind of policy requirements to ensure that data is really usable from the get-go. And that is both thinking about how you design data collection, but also systems for data sharing. And we run into the same issues as with Sydney as data siloing and simply a lack of availability of information about what data sets are even out there for ocean data. And so I also work a lot on the illegal fishing problem, and what we see is that there's a lot of really exciting new technological solutions, from sensors on boats that are capturing location to cameras on boats that are able to watch what crews are doing and see when fish are brought on board, and then you can use AI and other analytics to very easily process that data and feed it back to regulators. But this data comes with huge questions about whether or not it's actually usable and what the kind of algorithmic decision-making constraints are in a legal system. And so we're beginning to tackle those problems, but still in very early stages, and there's a lot of open space out there. And I think in this kind of conversation, it's really interesting to begin to design systems that take into account these constraints from the beginning.
Thank you so much, Annie. And then we will head down to Tali, Dr. Tali Vardi, and she's going to pose sort of a big thinking question and some opportunity for us, and then we will circle back and start tying all these things together.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to give props to this all-lady panel. This is the first time I've ever been on an all-lady panel. It's great to learn more about what you all do, and as Melissa said, I'm presenting an actual opportunity similar to what Annie was talking about using data to sort of really fit in within a legal context. There's also this opportunity to collect data that can specifically be used for management, and this is for an opportunity for data science and building a global platform for coral reef management. And I'll just orient you quickly here. This is a photograph, like a large-scale image of an actual coral reef. And then over here is that reef turned into some data that will be used for management. But I'll give you a little introduction. So just some background. I know coral reefs have been in the news a lot lately. I'm a bleeding heart conservationist, and I got into this system specifically because it's so efficient. You can just conserve 30% of the ocean's biodiversity if you just protect less than 0.1% of the seafloor. Come on, people. It doesn't seem that hard. I know the ocean's big, but that's not very much. And this does intersect with other sustainable development goals, reducing poverty. We feed 1 billion people, rely on coral reefs for sustenance. That's a lot. And that's beyond jobs in tourism and the coastal protection that reefs provide. Altogether are worth $350 billion per year. So this is a hugely valuable ecosystem, and it's been doing all of these things for free, and almost half of coral reefs are gone already due to lots of things. Climate change is one of them, but also a lot of bad local management. And the prediction is that almost all of them will be gone in 2050, when my kids will be 35 and 40 years old. So this is a really, really, really critical time for reefs. Doing something about climate change is obviously the big elephant in the room that we have to do something about, but there's a lot of local management that can help. And one of the reasons we're in this situation is because we haven't done a great job with management. And one of the reasons is because reefs are underwater and people can't see them and it's difficult to manage. But photomosaics can actually help with that. And this is a hilarious sped up photo of how you collect a photomosaic. So it's a 10 by 10 meter plot usually, so a pretty large area of the reef that you can capture. I'm showing you imagery from like the top of the line photomosaics that can be done, but you can also do this stuff pretty cheap. But data science can really help. I'm gonna, wait, before I get there, I'm just gonna show you what that sped up imagery of mowing the lawn of a reef does. It gives you this very, very high resolution image. It's archival. You can actually see what reefs look like in case we don't have that many in a few years. You know what to rebuild towards. You can identify species, you can identify non-reef organisms, et cetera. And then that gets turned into these blobs of colors over there. And currently that's done in a hand-drawn kind of way. It takes hours, tons of processing time. There are machine learning and neural network algorithms out there to kind of speed up this process, but the data scientists need to work with coral scientists in lots of different places in the world and managers to really take this technology that exists and turn it into the real way that we could manage reefs, that we need to manage reefs. And ideally, we would have these sort of images all over the world. Here's a restored reef, which is another great way, using photomosaics to visualize how restoration can actually have these great effects, is another great application of photomosaics. And it's a terrible image, but the National Academies just wrote a report on, and their #1 recommendation was to have like teams of data scientists in various places to help manage the reefs. So that's my specific opportunity that we can talk about. I know we only have a little bit of time, so we are going back to the slide, and I'll let Melissa take it from here.
Perfect. Thanks so much to everyone for speaking and for everyone for being here. I think we had some discussion topics prepared, but given the elevator unexpected queue and 15 minutes remaining, I think I'd like to open it to the floor first and see what you guys would like to discuss. And if you decide none of this was interesting, we have lots of interesting things we will talk about without you. Yeah, I will come pass the microphone around.
Thank you. Terrific panel. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. I was curious if you could tell us a little more about what are some of the legal constraints that you're facing. You seem to imply that you could collect data, but maybe you couldn't use the data for various legal reasons. I wonder if you could share some thoughts on that. And on a parallel, if you could tell us why, like, how do you convince someone, a fisherman, to put one of your items on the boat because it's potentially against their interests?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Philippe Burke. I work for an environmental impact fund in New York called Apache Capital. Thank you.
Yeah, so to the legal constraints to using data, there's, I think, two separate buckets of problems. And the first one is around how you access the data. And so commercially sensitive data from fishermen who maybe don't want you collecting data on them has very specific legal things you can do with it. And so most countries do not let that data be shared in any kind of public way. And so getting access to it for the right people, even for, say, neighboring countries where that information would be extremely useful in figuring out if there are illegal fishermen coming into their borders, is very difficult. So this data sharing across borders and also to potentially other useful parties like researchers can be very, very difficult. And there's a second category of questions, which is around whether or not data meets legal standards of validity, essentially. And that's a hugely varied category, but can range from things like whether or not sensors can be tampered with and what types of sensors you have on boats to who is actually collecting the data and whether they're deemed scientifically reliable. So a lot of different questions around that category as well, but there's a lot more in there.
Yeah, definitely. And to address, how do we get trackers on boats? The truth is, we're working in 30 different countries across a huge array of political contexts and different types of fisheries. And so we see a huge variety of mechanisms by which that happens. So it's never us as the tech company that has the social capital to get those trackers on board. It's always someone on the ground that is making that happen. And we see sort of top-down approaches where governments will mandate tracking and say, great news, as part of your permitting fee, you need a tracker on board because this is how the fishery is going to be managed. We also see a fair bit of bottom-up where we have cooperatives that are looking to either locally manage their resource because there isn't the sort of governance structures in place that they would like to see, and they're feeling their livelihood slipping away, so they are self-organizing and self-managing. We also have cooperatives that are going for certifications, like fair trade certification, and so they want the data to be able to directly connect with consumers. And then we see a bunch of folks sort of in the middle of the supply chain, importers and exporters of seafood that are buying from countries that the US and the EU have ever growing more strict regulations of data that needs to be available. And so they give out the trackers for free to the fishermen and say, we want to buy your product, but we also need the data to go with for exportation.
Hi, I'm Yoni Nachmani, and I work at Mapbox in DC on the imagery team. So I wanted to know, in your experience, could you comment on the usability of satellite imagery, nightlight imagery, even aerial imagery that can go below the surface, both usability in terms of analysis and also in terms of legal advocacy?
I mean, do you want to go down the line on that one, maybe?
Sure, I can talk about it in terms of all of those avenues, from satellites to low-flying images to drones to in-water imagery that I showed, are all, and to pencil and paper and your own eyeballs imagery, are all being used right now to monitor coral reefs. With the satellite imagery is not yet there in terms of, like, they can't really differentiate among species. They can kind of differentiate between live and dead reef, but that's like a thing that you don't want it to be, kind of. You want to really know. So it's not really there yet. And then the low-flying planes, it's a great technology, but it is unbelievably expensive. And so it's great that they're developing that technology, and maybe someday it will come down, but it's just not there yet. So we have amazing imagery for like a few select reefs from low-lying planes. And so that's kind of why I am putting my eggs in this basket, because it just seems like we have the technology. We have armies of people around the world who have cheap cameras in their pockets that are waterproof now, and we can get there. But there's lots of other ways to answer your question. So that's just the reef example.
Caitlin, did you want to talk about maybe some of the challenges there, or some of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, so we've done a number of projects using satellite imagery and drone imagery, and when we're working on projects for change analysis, one of a lot of the challenges come from, are you actually, can you recognize, was this the same building or not? So it's a lot of the comparison work in the data processing space. Can you actually realign your pictures over time to make sure that you're seeing the actual same locations? So we've had a lot more success with change analysis using drone imagery. We're working with the We Robotics team, Tanzania Flying Labs in Dar es Salaam, specifically looking at flood problems. So not directly life underwater, but really just showing the potential of the drones as a lightweight, lower cost option for taking these images.
Then Annie, did you have anything you wanted to throw in from the legal perspective?
Yeah, I do. And I love that I'm wearing the law hat fully. I also am a scientist, but I will be the lawyer for today. So imagery is really interesting because legally it's generally viewed as pretty reliable, which in a world of deepfakes and other ways of altering image may no longer be the case in the future. But for now, there's been several successful court cases that use satellite imagery to show changes in land use or illegal behavior, and that's kind of legally valid. But also, I think imagery raises really interesting consequences and questions that we don't necessarily think about as an environmental community around privacy and what the potential constraints are on pervasive environmental surveillance. And this is a huge issue in the ocean, where you have these ships and other type of working environments where people are living and working in the same kind of area. And traditionally, we like to protect the places where people live because they're private and we don't want the government intruding there. But there are very few privacy limitations on these areas right now. And I think as we get to a world of pervasive surveillance, we're going to need to really think about what those privacy impacts could be and how do we protect the ones that we want to.
Thank you. I think we have time probably for one or two more questions. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is George Wachazi. I'm from Calgary, Staten Island, and I have two questions. First of all, whether those data you showed us on the both sensory data is available for public, and whether universities or interested parties can analyze it. And second one is how reliable is the data, and what are the incentives for those fishermen to manipulate the either sensors or manipulate or data itself. And one thing which instantly comes in my mind, in countries which have very weak legal institutions, they might even incentivize corruptions. If it's not the fisherman's interest to give the data, they can bribe somebody. So I would like if you could elaborate on this two questions. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. That was a great question. Starting with the bribery and the security of the data, so and the reliability of this data. From our devices, they're completely self-contained. There's no on-off switch. There's no user interface. So all the data gets encrypted and sent to the cloud, where it then gets unpacked by us before it goes where it needs to go. And so one of the things that we spent a lot of time working on is making sure that tampering wouldn't be possible, that spoofing would be really hard, and those are some of the challenges that are faced with some of the more traditional older tracking technologies. So there really isn't an avenue for anyone to get in there. And one of the learning sort of experiences for me in this is, as we've started to work with governments internationally, we now work in 30 different countries and directly serve a lot of international governments. The whole process of connecting on an individual and human to human sort of level as a way for governments to evaluate the security of our data and the reliability of our data was fascinating, because from our perspective as a tech company in San Francisco, we're like, well, but the data, like, what, how, I mean, my face matters, because I mean, it just goes and it's encrypted and you can see the paths, and they're like, yeah, but I mean, we're coming from a context where you can always pay someone to change your data. I was like, that isn't even, Wow, yes, good point. No, that's not a thing we do. Right? And so that trust piece of, when it becomes a person-to-person trust versus what the technology is actually doing and how the how different technologies around the world historically have not been as reliable as you might expect. There have been a lot of advances in automation that I think shut down a number of those avenues. So our devices, for example, have no on-off switch. When you take them out of the box the first time and the solar panel sees light, they self-activate. We push out all of the updates over the air, and it's really autonomous. And then who has access to the data? Of course, we keep the data private. That's our promise to our clients. But we do a lot to facilitate data sharing. And so with each individual client, we help arrange data sharing partnerships in whatever the ways they need. So we work with a lot of multi-stakeholder sorts of groups where, maybe a fishing cooperative is collecting the data and they would like help from an NGO to analyze that data or do something with it. And they're willing to share all of that, but they want the names anonymized. And so we'll, create an anonymized set for the names or, a whole bunch of different things. But that data control is in the client's hands, not in ours. Yeah. So one more question.
Hi, I'm Austin. I was a data science for social good fellow at the Alan Turing Institute this past year in London with Yoni. And this question is for Caitlin, mainly around how do you source different projects? So do they come to you with sort of their ideas of what they want to solve, or do you kind of reach out kind of in a proactive way? And to what extent is your part of your criteria list for good projects part of SDGs, part of the SDGs Sustainable Development Goals? Could you share a little bit about that process?
Sure. So we source projects two ways. So one is that we work directly with foundations to work with their grantees. So the 11th Hour Foundation, for example, which is primarily funds work in the climate change space, they funded our DataKind to work with 6 of their grantees to do deep data science projects to help those organizations like Pelagic better achieve their theories of change, which were, in Pelagic's case, understand the behaviors of these fishing vessels. The other way that we have gone about sourcing projects is what we're calling impact practices. And if you come to our panel this afternoon, I think you'll hear a little bit more about that. But essentially, in this way, we have blanket funding to seek out the problems that we want to solve. So we're working in SDG 3, which is essentially universal healthcare. We're working specifically with community health workers in that problem space. We have the charge to go find the best partners, so the ones that are the most innovative, who have the greatest potential to scale solutions, who have problems that are applicable across the sector. So in that case, we are able to simply source potential projects that fit our criteria versus a funder kind of creating a subset for us to work on. Now, work being SDG aligned, that's something that we at DataKind have just been pushing forward on. We want to make a difference for humanity, and we believe that the SDGs are a good governing set of guidelines for how to do that. And if the work couldn't be laddered up that way, not to say we wouldn't do a project, but we'd have to question what is the impact of that? Like, how are we pushing value out to the world?
Thank you. Do we have one last question that we want to slip in? Yes.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. My name is Indrani Pell. I'm a scientist at the NOAA Center for Earth System Sciences at the City College, and I also teach at Columbia University at Sustainability Management Program of the Earth Institute. I'm going back to the question that this gentleman asked previously, and I've had my firsthand experience between working with the governments and the fishermen, the social scientists from Bangladesh. A part of my research focuses on understanding variations in fish catches in Bangladesh and its connections to the ocean atmospheric oscillations. And going back to the question about data issues that you find from the governments or working with the locals, I've found enormous levels of errors from provided by the governments that's available for the public versus the data that are collected on the ground by the social scientists maybe for the last 15, 16 years those are working with the fishermen. The government says that the productivity is going up, and the fishermen think that no, it's not the case. So my question is that, so have you people also found that kind of disparity between different data sets, and how do you deal with that kind of issue? Thank you in advance.
Thanks so much for the question. That I think could probably be a panel in and of itself. So as we're wrapping up, I would say data quality is definitely something that we all touched on, I think, and how to provide some of the cross checks that need to happen, and data cleaning is definitely a big part of the work that we are all doing. I think part of what technology is starting to be able to do is provide some automated cross-checks and ground truthing for information that's flowing in. So for example, we do a lot of work where fishermen may be self-reporting, or communities are self-reporting levels of catch, levels of bycatch, and those sorts of things. And when you start to employ some of the outlier analyses that are available and ask yourself, who is it that never ever has bycatch? Ever. Why? How is it that you never have bycatch, and the guys that are fishing in the same spot, next to you on the same days are reporting 50% bycatch of egg-bearing females, for example, right? And start to flag where patterns of misreporting are likely to be, and start creating incentives to get better quality data. We've seen a number of instances where you can start to create pressure for better reporting by simply being able to highlight the fact that we can see that this is unlikely to be true, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity to take all these data streams and start cross-referencing them and using them in smart ways. But I think this is part of the challenge that's here for this group, is how do we start taking all of this information that's available, all of these different data streams, and using them in smarter ways to make each data stream stronger, better, clean themselves up, and be integrated in a way that is more useful for management, for industry, for community livelihoods, and all the things that we are looking to tackle. So with that, unfortunately, our time here is done, but the panel, we will all be available, and we would love to continue this conversation. We'll be here all day, so please approach us, and let's have some more conversations. Thanks so much.